Hi, I'm Robert Mcgee from the United States. Thank you very much for inviting me to present a paper at this conference. The title of my paper is Current Thinking on Some Social and Moral Issues, a comparative study of Turkey and Cyprus. It was co-authored with Yanira Pedrides from Mexico. The sample was taken from the most recent edition of the World Values Survey. They interviewed more than 150,000 people in 92 countries, and the sample size for this particular study was a little over 3,300. And I looked at the surveys for three groups: people living in Turkey, people living in Cyprus who speak Turkish at home, and people living in Cyprus who speak Greek at home. And the survey instrument consisted of over 200 questions. 19 of those questions were on either social or moral issues. And they used a 10-point Likert scale, where 1 equals never justifiable and 10 equals always justifiable. And the first of the moral questions was claiming benefits, government benefits to which you're not entitled. And again, the options were never justifiable to always justifiable. For this question, all groups were strongly opposed, and the mean scores were less than 2.5, which on a scale of 1 to 10 means the opposition was very strong. The differences in mean scores are not significant for this question, which means they all had the same opinion. They were very strongly opposed to claiming government benefits to which they were not entitled. The next question was avoiding a fare on public transport. This is a moral question. All differences in the mean scores were significant in this case. All the scores were very low, though. If you look at the scores on a scale from 1 to 10, the Cyprus Greek speakers had the strongest opposition. Their mean score was 1.93. The Turkish sample was a little higher, 2.10, which again on a scale of 1 to 10 shows strong opposition. And then the Cyprus group of Turkish speakers was 3.92. They were the least opposed for avoiding a fare on public transport. So 3.92 shows a significant smaller degree of opposition, but it's still considerably less than 5.0. Stealing property was another moral issue. For this one, all groups showed strong opposition. The highest mean score was only 1.66. So on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is the strongest possible opposition, all of the mean scores were very strong. The Greek speakers were significantly more opposed to stealing than the other two groups, although all three groups were very strongly opposed to stealing. The Turkish sample and the Turkish speakers in Cyprus had the same opinion about stealing. And for cheating on taxes, all groups showed strong opposition to tax evasion. The highest mean score was only 1.74, which on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is never justifiable and 10 is always justifiable, this is almost never justifiable for all three groups. The Greek speakers were significantly more opposed to tax evasion than the other two groups, although all groups were very strongly opposed to tax evasion. Accepting a bribe was another moral issue. All groups showed strong opposition to taking a bribe. The highest mean score was only 1.78, which means opposition was very strong for all three groups. The Greek speakers were significantly more opposed to taking a bribe than were the other two groups, but all three were strongly opposed. Homosexuality, all the differences in mean score were significant for this one. The Turkish sample, the mean score was 2.08. They had the strongest opposition to justifying homosexuality. The Turkish speakers who lived in Cyprus were the second group, 3.44, And the group with the weakest opposition were the Greek speakers, and that they had a mean score of 4.01, which on a scale of 1 to 10, it shows the opposition was weak, but it could have been a lot weaker. And the question about prostitution, the highest mean score there was 2.29, indicating that all three groups had strong opposition. The group who lived in Turkey had the mean score that was significantly more opposed to prostitution than the other two groups. And the other two groups, the Turkish speakers and Greek speakers who lived in Cyprus, were pretty much equally opposed. Their mean scores were not significantly different. And for abortion, the Turkish sample was significantly more opposed to abortion than the other two groups. The mean score there was 2.57. And the Greek and Turkish speakers in Cyprus had equal opposition to abortion. In the case of divorce, the differences in mean score were significant for each group. The group that had the strongest opposition to divorce was the Turkish sample, the people who lived in Turkey. But their opposition was only 4.40, so it wasn't that strong on a scale of 1 to 10, where 10 is the weakest opposition. Turkish speakers who lived in Cyprus had a mean score of 4.82, so they were even less opposed to divorce. And the group that was least opposed to divorce were the Greek speakers, with a mean score of 5.55. They weren't too opposed at all, although there was some opposition. For the issue of sex before marriage, the differences in mean scores were always significant for all the combinations. The group that lived in Turkey had the strongest opposition. Their mean score was 2.35. And the group with the least opposition were the Greek speakers in Cyprus. Their mean score was 6.60. So not too much opposition. There was some opposition though, but 6.60 shows rather weak opposition. And for suicide, the highest mean score here was only 1.91, where 1 is never justifiable and 10 is always justifiable. So all three groups had very strong opposition to suicide. The Greek speakers had significantly stronger opposition to suicide than the other two groups. And the other two groups, the groups that lived in Cyprus, had about the same opinion on suicide. Their differences in mean scores were not significant. And for euthanasia, it's a kind of mercy killing. The Greek speakers were somewhat more opposed to euthanasia than the Turkey sample, and were significantly more opposed to euthanasia than the Turkish speakers in Cyprus. And for wife beating, the question asked if it's okay for a man to beat his wife, but they didn't ask if it's okay for a wife to beat the man. So I guess this is a little lopsided. But on the question of wife beating, all groups showed strong opposition to wife beating, and all differences in mean scores were significant. And you'll notice, though, that the lowest mean score, the highest mean score actually, is 1.8, which on a scale of 1 to 10 shows very strong opposition. The group that was most strongly opposed to wife beating was the group of Greek speakers who lived in Cyprus. The Turkish speakers in Cyprus came in next, and the group with the least opposition were the people who lived in Turkey. Although even there, the opposition was very strong because the mean score was 1.8, whereas 10 would be the least opposition. Another question was parents beating their children. Here the opposition was very strong for all groups. The highest mean score was 2.09, which on a scale from 1 to 10 means very strong opposition. The people who lived in Turkey were significantly less opposed to beating children than the Greek sample and the Turkish-speaking sample in Cyprus. For violence against other people, all differences in mean score were significant for this one, although all mean scores were also very low. The Greek speakers had the strongest opposition for violence against other people. The Turkish speakers in Cyprus came in second, and the people who lived in Turkey had the least or the weakest opposition. But even there, the mean score was 1.95, which means they actually had very strong opposition. Using terrorism as a political, ideological, or religious mean, this question only appeared in the Greek sample. It didn't appear in the Turkish sample, either Turkish speakers in Cyprus or Turkish speakers in Turkey. So we can't really do a comparison there, although the Greek speakers had a mean score of 1.25, which means very strong opposition. Another question was about having casual sex. In this case, the sample of people who lived in Turkey showed the strongest opposition. Mean score was 2.35. The Turkish speakers who lived in Cyprus also had strong opposition, 2.62. And the Greek with the weakest opposition consisted of the Greek speakers who lived in Cyprus, 3.09, which is still pretty strong opposition. Another question was about political violence. In this case, the Greek speakers had the strongest opposition with a score of 1.33, although this question wasn't asked for the Turkish speakers who lived in Cyprus or for the Turkish population in Turkey. So we don't really have a strong or an opportunity to compare the groups because only one group answered this question. For the death penalty, the Turkish speakers in Cyprus had the strongest opposition with a mean score of 2.60. Greek speakers came in next in the Turkish sample, or the people who lived in Turkey had the least opposition, 3.29. Again, with the mean score varied between 1 and 10, with 3.29, it was still fairly strong. So to summarize the findings, the Greek-speaking group tended to show the strongest opposition to violations of property and the issues that involve some kind of violence. The Turkey sample, the people who lived in Turkey, tended to have the strongest opposition to issues involving sex, and they had the weakest opposition to violence and the death penalty. And the Turkish speakers living in Cyprus tended to have the weakest opposition to violence of property rights, suicide, and euthanasia. And that concludes my presentation. So thank you very much and enjoy the conference.